Let me pose a question. When you consider power, which countries come to your mind? The United States, China, Russia. But suppose I were to tell you there's another country that was once ignored, once underestimated, now quietly remaking the entire world order? Suppose I were to tell you it's India? But there is a second story being written, one that nearly no one is ready for. And today, I'm going to take you inside that story. Stay with me because by the end of this you'll understand exactly why India is the nation everyone fears. Now let's start with the first clue. The awakening of a sleeping giant. Not too long ago India's economy was dismissed as slow-moving, tangled in red tape, impossible to modernize. But a decade ago, it did something that no one anticipated. It started to roar away. This wasn't growth alone. It was a transformation. Hundreds of millions out of poverty. New cities emerging overnight, a middle class bigger than the population of the United States. But that is only the tip of the iceberg. Because while the world was distracted watching trade wars between China and the US, India was secretly becoming the world's fastest growing large economy. The giant had stirred. But you're likely thinking, economic growth is not enough to make a country feared. You are correct. It's not. So let's pull back the next level. Military power no one anticipated. For decades, India's economic boom or global influence military was seen as large but outdated. Suddenly, that perception is obsolete. India is now the world's largest arms importer and one of the few countries investing in indigenous fighter jets, nuclear submarines, ballistic missiles, and space weapons. If consider this, India launched a successful anti-satellite missile test. That means they can now target and destroy satellites in space. Something that only a few countries have done. When it did so, defense planners all over the world knew that India was not catching up. It was leapfrogging. But even that is not the full story. While countries were preoccupied, India sparked a technological revolution. This is where the story becomes even more unpredictable. India has emerged as the digital backbone of the world. With more than 1 billion mobile connections, the biggest biometric database ever built, and an innovation ecosystem giving birth to unicorn startups at breakneck speed. Think back, when did you last read news of an Indian technology company making it to the headlines? It's more than you think. From fintech to AI, India isn't imitating trends, it's creating them. But still, this is not the full reason why India is feared. Because you can have an economy, an army and a technology sector, but if you don't have something deeper, none of that works. That something is cultural confidence. India's next generation population of over 600 million people is proudly ambitious. They no longer judge themselves by Western metrics. They believe in their heritage, their potential, and their destiny to lead. It is that psychological shift that makes a country unstoppable. But hold on, because the most strategic piece is yet to come. Strategic diplomacy. India is not aligning itself blindly with any single power bloc. Instead, it is balancing relationships with the US, Russia, Europe, Japan, and even engaging with China when necessary. This diplomatic ballet is exasperating traditional powers. You can't bully India into submission. You can't ostracize it. And that is precisely why countries are cautious. By now you must feel the pieces falling into place. But there is one other factor, the one no analyst can measure. But every leader feels it. It is the power everyone underestimated. Resilience. India has weathered colonialism, partition, wars, poverty, and yet it rises. While others shun, India accommodates. When troubles fall on it, India doesn't break, it survives. That's the testament of fear within hearts of those who believed that India would remain a follower forever. So here is the truth finally known. India is not feared because it is aggressive, but because it is unstoppable, because for the first time in centuries the world is finally getting the message that this country will no longer be neglected, and if you believe this surge can be halted, history will disprove you once again. The issue isn't that India is coming, the issue is, are you prepared for it? India's evolution information didn't occur with thunderous announcements or sudden revolutions. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes that grew over years. Back in the early 990, India opened the door for economic reforms. The reforms were tentative at first, small steps to break away from decades of stagnation. But running behind them was a deeper desire to be self-reliant, to compete, to move from the tag of a developing country to a powerful space power, ISRO's achievements force. Over time, this thirst was transformed into a silent resolve. Industries got modernized. The services sector took off. Information technology firms that were once tiny outsourcing boutiques grew into worldwide behemoths fueling banks, hospitals and governments across the globe. Tens of millions of young Indians acquired coding skills, management skills and entrepreneurial skills, creating a human capital engine so massive that it began altering the equations of world power in the global economy. Around the same time, infrastructure projects began changing cities. Roads, ports, airports, and power plants appeared where only decay had stood. Foreign investments poured in as companies realized India was no longer a market you could ignore. Slowly, India's GDP growth rate started to outpace older economies. But the most profound shift happened in mindset. A country long associated with poverty and limitations began to see itself differently. Ambitions rose. Middle-class families came to think that their children could enjoy futures as good or better than those of any in the West. That wasn't an overnight transformation. It was the stirrings of a giant that had been undervalued for too long. And once a giant begins to stir, you can't simulate that it is still sleeping. You have to face the fact that it has started to take its place in the world. For decades, foreign policy elites and military strategists saw India as a country of sheer size but limited capability. Its forces were big, indeed, but based on old equipment and glacially slow procurement cycles. But as Indian economic power increased, so did its aspiration to modernize its defense posture. And this time it wasn't simply a matter of catching up. This was about creating a whole new reputation as a serious military force. Billions of dollars were spent to modernize fighter planes, tanks, warships, and missile defenses. India was initiating indigenous defense initiatives set on diminishing reliance on imports and developing indigenous technology that rivaled the world's finest. The nation created T-6 fighter planes, commissioned the Arhant class of nuclear submarines and advanced its geopolitical moves or global alliances ballistic missile systems, like the AGY series that could strike way beyond its borders. One of the most signature moments was when India tested an anti-satellite weapon showing it had the capability to shoot satellites in space. Not many countries have that level of power projection. It was a big message. India had joined an exclusive club of military technological prowess. In addition to hardware, India has been consolidating its strategic doctrines and forging partnerships with countries such as the United States, France, Israel, and Japan to access sophisticated systems and collaborative exercises. It is no longer satisfied to remain a regional force in isolation. It is warning that it will protect its interests in the Indian Ocean and beyond. This has not come overnight, but the outcome is clear. India is no longer regarded as an anachronistic military giant of the past. It is an emerging power that states have to include in all calculations now. And that is precisely why so many are starting to dread its ascension. While the globe was mesmerized by Silicon Valley and China's technology giant, India was hard at work making preparations for a technological revolution that would amaze doubters. This was no longer just about relocating call centers or low-cost software coding jobs. It was a calculated strategy to make India an innovation hub in its own right. The centerpiece of this revolution was India's huge spend on digital infrastructure. The nation developed the world's biggest biometric identification system, ODR, which enrolled more than 1 billion citizens and spawned a whole new digital ecosystem. Overnight, folks who never had bank accounts could pay digitally and receive subsidies with a fingerprint scan. This jump-frog in inclusion wasn't just an internal success. It encouraged governments globally to learn from India on how it was done on such a scale. India's startup ecosystem, meanwhile, burst into life. Startup entrepreneurs created businesses in fintech, health tech, renewable energy, and artificial intelligence. Within a matter of a few years, India shifted from just a few unicorns to several dozens with valuations in why superpowers are worried the billions of dollars. Paytm, Flipkart, Baju, and Ola became household brands, disrupting industries and questioning multinational behemoths on their home grounds. Tech skills became India's strongest export. Indian engineers found themselves taking on leadership roles in some of the planet's most powerful firms from Google to Microsoft. But the real tale was unfolding in India itself. A generation of innovators demonstrating they no longer needed to migrate overseas in order to create something world-class. This technological rise wasn't boisterous or gaudy initially, but it was unyielding. And as the elements fell into place, a billion networked consumers, a culture of entrepreneurship, and a visionary government, India became a tech force that global competitors could no longer ignore or underestimate. Something powerful was happening beneath the economic data and military modernization. For generations, success was measured by how much they could imitate the West, how much they could assimilate into English, how much they could fit into someone else's model of modernity. But gradually that started to crack. A new generation arose that didn't feel they had to apologize for what they were or where they were from. For the first time in history, this generation of young Indians discovered to their surprise that their heritage was an asset, not a burden. They drew their confidence from thousands of years of civilization, philosophy, and art. Young Indians seized their attempts to fit in and began to stand out, proudly showcasing Indian culture, fashion, and ideas on the world stage. Bollywood was not a global phenomenon because it copied Hollywood, but because it dared to be unapologetically itself. Indian music, food and festivals spread to all continents by a diaspora that no longer viewed itself as visitors elsewhere but as ambassadors of a dynamic civilization. Vision 2047. India's grand plan within India. This belief in culture changed everything. It dictated politics, business and education. Entrepreneurs did not simply dream of making money. They aspired to address issues specific to their nation and demonstrate they could innovate and not replicate. Creatives told stories that struck a chord with a billion individuals. Leaders used language that was nationalistic in tone and not colonial remnants. This new cultural self-belief acted as a unifying factor. It gave rise to resilience in times of adversity, encouraged ambition in the work environment, and gave the country the courage to set its own success criteria. The outcome was a psychological transformation so strong that it started to radiate globally. Other countries observed that India's emergence wasn't merely economic or military. It was fueled by a spirit that would not remain small anymore. And that is the reason why it seems impossible to stop. India discovered much earlier that in a multipolar world, survival and power come not only on the basis of strength but also on strategy. While other countries took sides in international competitions, India followed a more nuanced course, one that baffled its detractors and unnerved its competitors. In the past 2 decades, India has fashioned a foreign policy that is not tightly aligned and not readily anticipatable. This style, sometimes referred to as strategic autonomy, enables India to act according to its national interests without being drawn into abiding alliances that may restrict its liberty of action. Rather than having to pick sides between the United States and Russia, India developed relationships with both. It purchased sophisticated defense equipment from Russia, such as the S-400 missile defense system, while also inking milestone defense cooperation pacts with Washington. It became a member of the Quadrilateral Security Forum called the Quad with the US, Japan, and Australia, marking a like-minded vision of a free, open Indo-Pacific. At the same time, India has maintained channels of dialogue with China, even message to the youth of India amid tense standoffs along the Himalayan border. Some countries expected India to fully decouple from Beijing after the clashes in Ladakh. But India knows that in the real world economic interdependence and security competition often coexist. Instead of taking dramatic turns, India took a measured approach, limiting Chinese tech firms at home while keeping lines of diplomacy open. This delicate balancing act goes well beyond Asia. India has sought deeper links with Europe via trade and green technology alliances. It has fortified relations with Israel, particularly in defense innovation and cybersecurity. In Africa, India has made significant investments in development, education, and infrastructure, becoming a partner of preference for countries skeptical of Chinese loans. A key to India's diplomacy is the credibility it has established as a democratic alternative to authoritarian models. In contrast to most emerging powers, India has a record to boast of in electoral democracy and abiding faith in the rule of law even if imperfectly enforced. This provides New Delhi with moral influence in institutions such as the G20 and the United Nations. When Indian leaders articulate fairness, equity and development, most nations of the global south heed their words because they can observe India's own path from poverty to potential. This strategic positioning has also transformed India's image in the eyes of major powers. Washington no longer sees India as merely a regional player, but as a critical partner in containing China's influence. Moscow values India's role as an enduring customer and friend even as the real power of unity or culture Russia draws closer to Beijing. European capitals look more and more to India as a necessary economic and geopolitical counterweight to other powers observing, it produces a sort of strategic unease. India has choices. India has bargaining power and India is willing to exercise both. When it banned half a dozen Chinese apps in a matter of one night or declined to be part of some trade baskets that were not in its best interests, it demonstrated that it was not afraid to tread on its own even at an economic price. Such uncertainty makes India more difficult to pressure or isolate. Secondly, India's international impact is heightened by its huge diaspora. More than 30 million individuals who constitute influential bridges in politics, commerce, academia, and technology. Indian origin source heads some of the most recognized global companies. Indian origin lawmakers occupy seats in the US, the UK, Canada, and more. These linkages spread India's soft power beyond what any treaty or military alliance could do individually. Combined, India's diplomacy is neither submissive nor aggressive. It is purposeful, agile and having a distinct aim to safeguard the independence of India and a seat in every forum in which the destiny is charted. This explains why there are so many countries in discomfort because India cannot be relegated to the status of a junior partner or herded into another person's grand design. It is a game changer scripting its own game book and it is playing it wonderfully well. Yes,